Chapter 18. A Shanghaied crew and scurvy, our poor bunkmates in a white squall. The following September we set sail for the Gilbert Islands with a load of trading articles to exchange for pearl shell. In our crew were just 3 old members, Bolger the Swede and Axel Olsen. The remaining men were shipped aboard at Sydney. There was a labour strike on in Sydney at the time, and to find a crew of non-union men willing to ship for the voyage was impossible. Father was up against it, but a crew he had to have, and he was never a man to be balked by seeming impossibilities. Now, there is a widespread belief that Shanghaiing as a common practice flourishes only in the stories of Jack London, Conrad, and other writers of sea tales, but deep-sea captains and sailors know better. So father in his difficulty sought out a sailor's runner, a ratty-faced little crimp familiar with the waterfront, and made his deal, £5 a head for a crew. "I want them aboard ship by 5 o'clock flood tide. I'm going to sail tonight without waiting for any goddamn pilot and tugboat," he said to the crimp and returned to the vessel. About 4:30 that afternoon a launch sputtered alongside, and the mate and 2 sailors lowered a Jacob's ladder over the side. The man on the launch yelled up at them, "Put over the cargo boom. These beggars won't come to until you hit the equator." I looked over the side and saw 8 lumps of flesh, 8 dead men, so it seemed, sprawled over the bottom of the launch like so many sacks of wet wheat. With every roll of the launch, the bodies pitched from side to side in grotesque rhythm. Our men rigged up a cargo boom and tackle, and the man on the launch slipped a running bowline around one of the limp hunks of flesh. "Take it away!" he grunted, and the sailors, with my help, pulled up the load. It was a blond, husky Scandinavian. His body landed on the deck with a dull thud. "Is he dead?" The mate only looked at me contemptuously, as if anything could kill a Swede, and threw back the tackle for the next load of flesh. Over and over again they repeated that process until a row of 8 bodies was on deck. The mate told me to call my father. I went below, almost sick, for I thought the men were dead. However, I was better trained in the code of the sea than to let anyone see I was affected by the sight of 8 men laid out like corpses on the deck of the schooner. I brought my father back with me. He reached down and picked up the foot of the first man and let it drop back with a lifeless thud on the deck. "He'll be a good man on the halyard," he said, and passed on to the next one. He was a dirty, uncouth-looking person, so black with coal dust that he looked negroid. "What a hell of a mess this is to soak me £5 for!" And he passed on to the next, until he had felt the muscles of each one. Satisfied that he had a good load of beef to pull on ropes in a storm, or pump ship if a leak should spring, father signalled the launch to cast off. Turning to the mate, father said, "Take these so-and-sos forward to the fossil head and lock them in, and come ahead and stand by. We'll sail out tonight anyway and sign those," indicating the unconscious sailors, "on the ship's articles when they come out of it. You, Joan, take the wheel. I'll lend a hand to set enough sail to get out of here." I was just short of 16 at the time, husky and as strong as most men, and I felt myself to be as good a sailor as ever held a ship to the course. I went up on the poop deck to the helm, unleashed it, and pulled with all my strength on its spokes. "Hard over!" called father, and I slowly turned the big wheel. Hard over means to turn the wheel completely around. Under my hands the wheel didn't turn as quickly as it should have, and father let out a volley of curses at me that made the sky blue, but it also put vitality into me, or scared some more strength into my arms, for I pulled the helm around as the wind caught the topsails, and we glided out of the heads for the Gilbert Islands. It was a hard week, that first one out, for the men were so drugged and beaten that they were slow in regaining consciousness. 3 sailors, father, the cook, and myself navigated that big schooner, which in fair weather ordinarily required 16 men to handle. I took the helm in the daytime, the sailor stood by the fore and mainmasts, and the cook tended the jibs. Father slept in his clothes. On the 4th day out we ran into the electrical storms off Lord Howe Island. Lord Howe is a barren island off the Australian coast, around which all the fury of the China Sea, Indian Ocean, and South Pacific gathers. I'll never forget it. Lightning so blinding and near that it made our eyes blur with blue shadows. Thunder which rattled so loud and so close that it reverberated on the deck. And then, right in the midst of the thunderstorm, the wind suddenly veered from southeast to north, northwest, and then we had to tack ship to keep from running aground. The mate went aloft to free a tangled block from the mizzen topsail. He had reached the cross trees and was straddled on them to balance himself as he freed the rope from the block. The lightning rods on the tops of the mast were alive with fire. They looked like huge gas jets of flame on top of each spar. I was at the wheel, tied there by 2 ropes to keep from washing overboard in the seas that were sweeping over the poop deck. Father looked up to see if all was clear aloft so he could let go the mizzen boom to tack over, when a streak of lightning made him cover his eyes with his hands to keep from being blinded. At the wheel I put my face down in my overalls bib, and I guess the other men hid their eyes from the fiery onslaught of streak lightning, for not one of them saw just what happened. The mate aloft must have touched a ring bolt of steel on the mast and received the full shock. He dropped from the cross trees to the deck, and his body was crushed into a mangled pulp by the fall. Before anyone could reach the spot where he fell, a green sea swept across the deck and carried him overboard. It was too horrible, too gruesome. I crumbled inside. I don't know what would have happened to me if a sea hadn't washed over the poop and almost smothered me with water, bringing me to. The ship was around or tacked, and we were trying to hold her head up into the wind and keep her out of the belly of the swells to avoid capsizing. We couldn't possibly hold out much longer, as the terrific strain had told on her strength. There seemed only one thing to be done as a last resort: revive the Shanghai sailors. Father went into the forecastle and attempted to rouse them. They only moaned and turned over and slept, or didn't move at all. It was 4 days later, exactly 8 days from the time they were sent aboard ship, that they regained consciousness. The crimp had made a good job of them. He had first drugged them, and then his gang beat them to lifelessness. Of the 8, only 2 were sailors. The others were not worth their beans at sea as a crew. One was a waiter, another a truck driver, another a coal passer, another a cattleman, and still another a hopeless dope fiend. The crimp had a hard time finding heads to make up his blood money of £5 apiece, so he had raided a waterfront saloon, and made wholesale slaughter of the available men he had found standing at the bar. All of them except the 2 sailors were seasick and cowardly of the storm. With the mate dead and a bunch of landlubbers for a crew, in one of the worst storms in the South Pacific, Father turned into a savage. The men had to sign on the ship's articles as seamen. It is maritime law that every man voluntarily sign his own name to the articles, and in doing so, he becomes liable to obey the laws of the sea as dictated by the master of the ship. Once those men had put their signatures to the articles, Father had them. They didn't want to sign, but when he invited them to sign or get off and walk, they wrote their names willingly. Immediately after signing, the coal passer and cattleman made the mistake of refusing to go aloft to shift the topsails in the storm. Father took his revolver and pointed it at them. "You dirty blank so-and-sos, you're sailors now. Get aloft and make fast those sails, or you'll go over the side. Swimming isn't crowded around here." And he pointed to the seething ocean to windward. They went aloft. The entire trip up through the islands was like that. Father was captain, mate, and part of the crew, and I was chief helmsman. The crew were unwilling prisoners, and they made life aboard a lively hell for us all. As a result of poor seamanship and adverse winds, it took us 93 days to reach Papua. The ship was a mass of wreckage on deck. Broken pieces of booms and rigging cluttered the scuppers. There was never any time during that trip that we had an uneventful day. Southerly blusters, those vicious white squalls of the South Sea, smacked our schooner and tossed us around like a cockleshell on the water. Then we reached the doldrums, that great area of deadly calms. Even in the calms there was no respite from the slapping and smashing of the rigging, which was useless for sailing purposes in its battered condition. groundswells from some distant storms shook the Minnie A. Kane until she wallowed like a drunken sailor. Most people think the real dangers of the sea are storms, but to the deep-sea sailor there is a terror greater than wind or sea which stalks in the wake of sailing ships long overdue. Scurvy. Scurvy is caused by a lack of fresh food, unhealthy water, and heat on salt foods. The disease acts insidiously. The victim doesn't know he has it until terrific pains in his stomach make it impossible for him to eat anything. Then come headaches, blinding and maddening. The body appears dry and withered like a husk of a coconut. Fever and delirium follow, and in a short time, if medical relief or fresh food is not obtained, death. Contrary to popular ideas and the maritime law of all countries, a ship's medicine chest usually contains nothing but friar's balsam, which is seagoing iodine, salts, and blue ointment for vermin, none of which is a cure for scurvy. Under the hardships of our voyage, it was no wonder that we fell victim. For days at a time, while the decks were awash with swirling seas, the cook could prepare no meals. Time and time again he vainly attempted to build a fire in the galley, but no sooner would it begin to draw than the ship would list heavily to port, submerging the galley, cook, and his pans in green seas. As a consequence, we lived on dried saltfish and lime juice. The Shanghaied men couldn't even stomach that, and they were the first to be stricken with scurvy. The coal passer had the worst dose of it all. His teeth dropped out one by one. His body withered. He seemed at the point of death. The cattleman, who was a sailor by circumstance, lost his eyesight. None of us could sleep. We put up the distress signal at the masthead and took turns standing on lookout aloft for signs of another ship or tramp steamer to bring us relief. That red flag branded us as an outlaw, a crippled ship with diseased, dying crew on board. All around us lay the monotonous circle of horizon without a sign of life, except for an occasional whale or school of flying fish. And so we wallowed on, waiting for death. I was the last to get the scurvy. I suppose it was because I was the youngest and healthiest on board. When it did hit me, it was horrible. I felt like I was dying from the outside in. I would sit for hours and peel dead skin off my body. When I look back on those days now, I wonder how we ever lived through it. Scurvy seems to make savages of men at sea. They lose all sense of balance. There is nowhere to turn for help, nothing to do but suffer and wait for it to finish you. Only my father raved at the bad luck. It's a goddamn shame. If I had anything but a bunch of vomiting landlubbers for a crew, we'd be in Honolulu now. He paced up and down the poop deck from the rail to the binnacle and back. I crouched on the hawser bit astern, picking dead skin off my arm. Porpoise! The cry brought us all to our feet. There, close to us, on the windward side, was a school of about 20 porpoises, diving and snorting in the spray of the bowsprit. All hands on deck! Man the capstan! Stand by the harpoon! Father rushed forward over the debris on deck. In less than 5 minutes, every living man aboard was on the fossil head, standing by to help land a porpoise. A porpoise is a mammal, and its meat is very much like that of beef. If we could land one, it would furnish fresh food for a week. Father stood down on the martingale under the jibboom, harpoon in hand. We waited, praying for the porpoise to come near. The thin leader line from the harpoon was fastened to a 3/4-inch rope made fast to the capstan. So eager was I to help land the porpoise that, not realizing what I was doing, twisted the leader line of the harpoon around my hands. A big porpoise dived under the bow. Father hurled the harpoon. It struck the porpoise amidships and sunk in deep. The porpoise let out a squeal like a stuck pig and dived. "Play out the leader line," called Father. He was going to let the porpoise have plenty of rope, for it couldn't get away with a steel harpoon through it, and sooner or later that harpoon would take its life. 6 fathoms of line played out quickly, and then suddenly I was jerked with terrific force to the edge of the fossil head. The porpoise, diving deep, had used up the slack, and I couldn't let go of the rope twisted around my hands. Slowly it slipped as the porpoise, with its 2 tons of weight, pulled, and the slipped rope burned inches into my hands, cutting, burning the flesh off down to the bone. I was being dragged overboard with only my own strength against that of the maddened, dying porpoise. 2 sailors grabbed me, trying to hold me back. They nearly pulled my arms from their sockets, but the porpoise took us all closer and closer to the edge of the low rail. Father looked up from the martingale and saw what was happening. He reached out, grabbed the taut leader line, and with a jerk using all his strength managed to slack for just a moment. The porpoise under the water changed its course, turning back underneath the keel. It saved my life. The leader line caught in the hawse hole and held until one of the men cut the line free. The porpoise was gone, taking the harpoon with it. The line was twisted and cut into my hand so deeply that Father had to pull it out. He looked at the raw flesh hanging on the bone without wasting words, dashed for the galley. In a minute he was back with a handful of wet salt. "Hold out your hands." I held them out, and he spread that wet salt on the deep burns. The pain was so great I thought I couldn't stand it. I suppose now if that happened to me I would cry or moan or faint, but then I took it like a sailor. I cursed until the air was blue, and cursing that way held back the tears, for I would have rather have been drawn and quartered than let a sailor see me bawl, even though those sailors were seasick, shanghaied landlubbers. The man set about to harpoon another porpoise, and got one on the deck within an hour. As they hoisted it aboard, it opened its long snout and squealed and hollered. Father shot it several times, then chopped its head off with an axe. The men were like vultures, hovering around for the first taste of its blood to relieve their fevered throats. The Jap cook snatched the axe from Father's hand and licked the raw blood off of it. Then Father hacked off a piece of blubber and meat for each sailor. He gave me a piece of its bloody liver, and the tragedy then was not my burned hands, but that I couldn't hold anything in them to eat. I laid down on the fossil head and lapped up the blood, chewing at the liver like a dog. That fresh blood saved our lives. 5 days later we dropped in Papua, a plague ship manned by semi-delirious men. It is such things as this that makes me wonder why land folks think being the daughter of a sea captain is so romantic.